For decades, historians and psychologists have been unsettled by a single question. How could a man at the very center of Nazi power simply walk away? Why did he fly alone into enemy airspace without warning and insist he was acting in the name of peace? To understand the flight of Rudolf Hess, we have to look past the military records. We have to look at the slow collapse of a human mind under the weight of absolute devotion. On the night of May 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess climbed into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 110. He was at an airfield in Augsburg, Germany. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, yet he was utterly alone. He had no escort. He carried no official orders. He left behind no explanation that aligned with military logic. He headed north. For hours, he navigated the North Sea, dodging British defenses and tracking his position by the stars. By the following morning, he was in British custody. By that evening, Adolf Hitler had publicly declared him mentally unfit. What followed was more than just a failed mission. It was a moment that exposed the fragile boundary between loyalty and delusion. This is the story of a man who lived a double life and what his actions reveal about the psychological cost of total obedience. To understand the end of the story, we have to go back to the beginning. Rudolf Hess was not an outsider. He was there when the movement was nothing more than a few dozen men in a beer hall. He joined the party in the early 1920s and quickly became its most devoted disciple. When Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg after a failed coup, Hess was right there with him. He didn't just share a cell, he helped birth the ideology itself. He sat at a typewriter and transcribed the words that would become Mein Kampf. He edited the pages, he organized the thoughts. For Hess, Hitler was not just a politician. He was a figure of destiny. He was a secular god. Over the next decade, Hess rose through the ranks. He became the deputy Führer. On paper, he was second only to Hermann Göring. He was the man who introduced Hitler at every major rally, his voice trembling with a kind of religious fervor. His authority was real, but his skills were limited. He wasn't a master of industry or a genius of war. His value was his faith. He was the altar boy of the Third Reich. But by the early 1940s, the structure of the Nazi state began to change. It grew larger and more bureaucratic. It became a machine of specialized cruelty. Decision-making moved away from the old guard and toward men like Himmler, Göring, and Martin Bormann. Hess, who had once been the gatekeeper to the Führer, found himself pushed to the margins. He was a symbolic figurehead in a world that now demanded cold, administrative efficiency. For a man whose entire identity was built on being close to the center, this move to the edges was devastating. At the same time, the geopolitical reality was becoming desperate. Germany was preparing for its largest gamble, the invasion of the Soviet Union. But Britain remained unconquered. Hitler was haunted by the memory of World War I, the fear of a prolonged conflict on two fronts. Inside this atmosphere of high tension and personal isolation, Hess became fixated on a single idea. He believed he could save the regime and his leader by ending the war with Britain through a personal act of diplomacy. There is no credible evidence that Hitler ever asked him to do this. No secret documents have ever surfaced. No witnesses have ever testified to a hidden plan. In fact, Hitler's public and private statements were clear. Britain was to be broken, not bargained with. But Hess began to operate under a different kind of logic. He convinced himself that Hitler secretly wanted peace, but was prevented from seeking it by the evil advisors surrounding him. Hess believed He was the only one who truly understood his leader's heart. He convinced himself that taking this flight was not an act of disobedience, but the highest form of loyalty. He was acting on what he called the unspoken will of the Führer. This is where the psychology becomes unavoidable. Hess was showing signs of deep isolation long before he boarded that plane. He had become obsessed with astrology, alternative medicine, and secret signs. He was losing his grip on the functional world. For someone whose sense of worth depended entirely on his proximity to power, being sidelined created a vacuum. Gradually, Hess filled that vacuum with a fantasy. He stopped seeing himself as a failing official and started seeing himself as a chosen intermediary, a man uniquely positioned by fate to change the course of history. He began to interpret everyday coincidences as divine confirmation. Personal conviction replaced external reality. The flight itself was a feat of skill, but the mission was a disaster of judgment. When he parachuted into Scotland, he expected to be met with respect. He believed the Duke of Hamilton would recognize his importance and facilitate a meeting with the king. He believed the British people were tired of war and waiting for a sign. He was wrong about everything. The British were stunned, then dismissive. To them, he wasn't a diplomat. He was a high-ranking war criminal who had literally fallen out of the sky. His proposals were absurd. He suggested that Britain should simply accept German control over all of Europe. They weren't just rejected, they were laughed at. In Germany, the reaction was swift and brutal. Hitler was terrified that the world would think he had sent Hess to beg for peace. He didn't just distance himself, he erased Hess. He stripped him of his honors and told the German people that his deputy Führer had been suffering from hallucinations and mental exhaustion for years. Hess was now a man without a country, a man without a leader, and a man without a cause. He spent the rest of the war in British custody, and this is where his mind truly began to fracture. During interrogations, he became increasingly erratic. He claimed he had lost his memory. He complained that his food was being poisoned by Jewish secret agents. He suspected the guards were using hypnotic beams to influence his thoughts. Psychiatrists from around the world came to study him. Some concluded he was a master manipulator, faking his symptoms to avoid the gallows. Others saw a man in the grip of genuine progressive schizophrenia. But the most haunting possibility is that his perceptions were sincere, that he had lived so long in a world of manufactured truth that he could no longer tell the difference between a fact and a feeling. At the Nuremberg trials, the world saw a ghost. Hess sat in the dock, looking gaunt and hollowed out. Sometimes he seemed to follow the evidence with sharp attention. Other times he stared into space, rocking back and forth. When it was his turn to speak, he gave a rambling statement about how his inner voices had guided him. The court found him fit to stand trial, but they didn't sentence him to death. Instead, he was given life imprisonment. In 1947, he was moved to Spandau prison. One by one, the other Nazi leaders, Speer, Dönitz, Schirach, served their time and were released. By the mid-1960s, Rudolf Hess was the only prisoner left in a massive complex designed to hold 600 people. He stayed there for 20 more years. The Allied powers, the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets rotated guards every month. They spent millions of dollars every year to keep one old man behind bars. He lived in a world of extreme artificial rigidity. He was allowed almost no contact with the outside world. He was forbidden from talking about the past. He walked the same circle in the garden every day. He ate his meals in silence. Psychologically, this kind of isolation is a desert. It doesn't just silence the mind, it turns it inward. Without anyone to challenge his thoughts, his internal narratives became set in stone. The myths he had created about his flight, his loyalty, and his mission became his only reality. In 1987, at the age of 93, Rudolf Hess was found dead in a small reading cabin in the prison garden. A cord was wrapped around his neck. The official ruling was suicide. Yet, because of who he was, the questions never stopped. His family claimed he was too frail to have killed himself. Conspiracy theories emerged, suggesting he was silenced because he knew too much about secret peace talks. Investigations were launched, closed, and reopened. Even in death, certainty escaped him. So, when we look back, who was Rudolf Hess? Was he a man of peace who lost his way? Was he a devoted servant who was betrayed by the master he loved? Or was he something more common and more dangerous? The most disturbing answer is that Hess was the ultimate product of his environment. He was a man who surrendered his judgment to an ideology. When the system he devoted his life to finally cast him out, he didn't wake up. He didn't change. He simply retreated into a version of events where he was still the hero. He showed us that when loyalty is detached from reason, it becomes a form of madness. He showed us that ideology can be a drug, one that provides meaning at the cost of the truth. History often focuses on the men who gave the orders, but the story of Rudolf Hess reminds us to look at the ones who followed them. It asks us what happens to a person when they stop asking, "Is this true?" and only ask, "Is this what I am told to believe?" Hess died in a prison of his own, making long before he ever reached Spandau. He was a man who gave up his selfhood for a cause, only to find that when the cause was gone, there was nothing left of the man.